Hey guys, it's Michael Kummer here, and in today's video we'll talk about Lumen, a metabolic handheld breath analyzer that's supposed to enable you to hack your metabolism. In this video we'll cover what Lumen is, how it exactly works and how the technology behind it works, what is metabolic flexibility, how accurate is the device, how much does it cost, is it worth it, and I'll also share with you my discount code. So we have a lot of stuff to cover in today's video, but before we get started, make sure you subscribe to my channel and you click on the little alert button so you get notified when I publish more videos like this. So what is Lumen? Well, as I've mentioned in the intro, Lumen is a metabolic breath analyzer that can tell you if your body is currently using carbs or fat for fuel. And why is that important? Well, to understand that, we have to talk very briefly about how the human metabolism works and what the differences are between burning carbs and burning fat for fuel. So let's talk about the metabolism real quick so you can understand how Lumen works and why it does what it does. Generally speaking, there are two sources of fuel for your body. Either carbohydrates that get converted into glucose, which is sugar, or fat that can get converted into ketone bodies that your cells can use for energy as well. So let's assume you eat a meal that's high in carbohydrates. Once you get those carbohydrates digested, your liver starts converting those carbs into glucose. And so your blood sugar spikes, you have a lot of glucose in your bloodstream, and that's a signal for the pancreas to release insulin, which is a storage hormone that can get those glucose molecules out of your bloodstream and into your cells where the mitochondria can use it for energy. If you eat a meal that's high in fat, and in particular if you're fat adapted, we'll talk about what that means in a little bit, then your liver can convert those fat or fatty acids into ketone bodies, and your brain and other cells in your body can use those ketone bodies for energy as well. So those are, on a very high level, the two ways of how your body can use food for energy. Now, there are two important factors to take into account when talking about either a carb-based or a fat-based diet. The problem is with the Western diet, with the standard American diet, and chances are if you're on a standard American diet, then you run on glucose predominantly, meaning your cells are used to using glucose as its the primary source of fuel. The problem is, if there is too much glucose in your bloodstream because you're eating a lot of carbs and you eat carbs all the time, then your pancreas can't release enough insulin to take all of that glucose and get it out of the bloodstream. In addition to that, your cells, if the insulin receptors in your cells are saturated, then they don't need any more glucose, they don't need any more fuel, the tank is full, so to say. And so what happens next is that, first of all, your cells, as your pancreas releases more and more insulin, get resistant and less sensitive to insulin. And in addition to that, your liver starts converting that glucose into fat and then stores that fat around organs, around your midsection, your thighs, anywhere on the body basically. And that's the primary reason why you might be gaining weight or not losing it, because the amount of carbs that you eat are significantly more than what your body can use, and so it keeps storing it for a time where you don't have access to food. It's an evolutionary and ingenious mechanism. The problem is, in our society, there is always food. We never get to the point where we don't eat for extended periods, so our body can start using its own fat storage. We never get to that point, and that's why we get fatter and fatter and fatter. In fact, about 70% of American adults are overweight and 30 to 40% are obese. Those are shocking numbers and predominantly caused by a high carbohydrate diet. Now, in terms of fat, if your body is fat adapted, meaning if it has been enabled to use fat as its primary source of energy, then that not only means that you can use the fat that you eat as fuel, but if you don't eat fat, or during times when you don't eat, your body can actually start accessing its own fat storage. And regardless how skinny you are, you have approximately 20,000 calories worth of fat on your body that can be used for energy. So if weight loss is your goal, then eating a lot of fat, healthy fats, and reducing your carbohydrate intake causes actually your body to burn more and more fat. And that's important to understand as we discuss Lumen and how Lumen works. So let's get back to the device and talk about why you would want to use Lumen. Why is it important to understand if your body is currently burning carbs or fat for energy? Well, first of all, if your goal is to lose weight and in particular lose fat, then it's good to understand when your body is in fact burning fat. If you want to improve your energy levels, if you want to improve your overall health and fitness, if you want to reduce the risk of developing a metabolic or chronic disease. And to the latter point, it's important to understand that insulin insensitivity or insulin resistance, meaning the inability of your cells to react to the insulin and store that glucose that the insulin hormone wants to get into those cells, is the primary reason and cause for most metabolic diseases, including obviously diabetes, the classic case, but also Alzheimer's, dementia, stroke, cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure. All of those metabolic diseases that most Americans and most Westerners really die from at a certain point, all of those go back to a disturbed glucose metabolism caused by a high carbohydrate intake. And so those are just some of the reasons why you may want to consider using Lumen to find out how your metabolism is doing and what you can change to make a shift. So the ultimate goal of Lumen is to increase your metabolic flexibility. And that's a term that means your body's ability to efficiently shift back and forth between burning fat and burning carbs, depending on what you feed the body. And metabolic flexibility is incredibly important because it allows you to burn fat when you have a high-fat meal, but when you eat carbs, it starts using carbs. And that in the long run increases your health markers, decreases inflammatory factors, and puts you on a better path to health. So how does Lumen work? Well, the technology behind Lumen isn't necessarily new. Breath analyzers have been around in clinical settings and have been used by elite athletes for a long time. But the problem so far was that doing a breath analysis to find out if you're burning carbs or fat has been expensive. It requires clinical equipment. You have to go to, clinical setting or whatever to do those tests, and they're expensive and not accessible to people like you and me. And so what Lumen has done is they've put a breath analyzer that includes basically a flow meter that detects how much air is flowing through it and a sensor into this little handheld device. And the way it works is you breathe in and then you breathe out. And what Lumen measures then is the respiratory exchange ratio. And that's a term for the ratio between the O2, the oxygen that you inhale, and the carbon dioxide that you exhale. So the ratio between those two can tell the device and can tell you ultimately whether or not you're burning mostly carbs or mostly fat. And so in the case of Lumen, what that means is it measures the CO2 content. And generally speaking, the more CO2 in your exhaled breath is, the more carbs, or the more likely it is that you are burning carbs instead of fat. So if you're watching this video and you're like, okay, I want to lose some weight, I want to gain more energy, I want to be healthy, I want to be fitter, I want to change my diet, I want to get away from some of those carbs more towards a low-carb type of diet, maybe a ketogenic diet. How does Lumen work? How can it help me to make that happen? Well, it's fairly simple. What you basically do is you start out with a calibration day where you establish your baseline, your metabolic baseline, so to say, and then you use Lumen a couple of times a day, first thing in the morning, after you have fasted overnight, and then maybe before a workout, after a workout, or really any time that you want to. And as you take those measurements, Lumen will tell you if you're burning carbs or if you're burning fat, and it will give you recommendations like today, reduce your carb intake to X number of servings. Tomorrow we're gonna have a high carb day, so we can see how you're responding to those carbs. And so it will guide you with nutritional advice on what you should eat, and then you run those tests and do your breathing to see how you respond. And after about 4 weeks, you get a metabolic flexibility score that tells you how flexible your metabolism is. And ideally, if you follow the protocol, after the 4 weeks, you have already established a certain metabolic flexibility that allows you to switch back and forth between eating mostly fat and eating a few more carbs. So the goal of Lumen is not necessarily to put you straight onto a ketogenic diet with no carbs and mostly fat and moderate amounts of protein. Even though it kind of goes in that direction, but it's really meant to help you understand how your carb intake and fat intake are impacting your metabolism and what tweaks you can make from a dietary perspective to be and become metabolically more flexible and to start burning fat for energy, because that's really the most important point of the whole exercise. You want to get and enable your body to start burning fat when you want to, because that means, as I've mentioned before, it will not only burn the fat that you eat, but also your own body fat. And that's an incredibly powerful weight loss tool. That's why the ketogenic diet is so popular. People use it to quickly lose a lot of weight. So now that you've heard a lot about Lumen, you might want to know how much is it. Well, Lumen retails for $299. That's almost $300, and it's certainly not an inexpensive device. However, one of the most important things with any change that you want to make to your lifestyle, in particular to your dietary lifestyle, is to find something that you remain motivated on doing until the rest of your life. So a diet is not something that you can do for 3 weeks or for 4 weeks and then go back to your old eating habits, because it's not going to work. So you need to stick with something. And I believe that with Lumen, there is a very high motivational factor for a couple of reasons. Well, first of all, the device looks pretty slick and futuristic. So you want to show that to your friends and family and get them inspired on, showing them what it can do. The other thing is, every morning when you take your breath, you get a score, and it's almost like the recovery score of my Whoop that I'm looking forward to in the morning when I do the test after getting up. And so it keeps you motivated to see, hey, you got up after a 12 or 13 hour overnight fast and I'm predominantly burning fat, or I'm only burning fat. That's incredibly motivating to sticking to the diet or to the dietary framework that you have chosen. The other thing is Lumen, via its app, offers a lot of nutritional advice, a lot of insights, a lot of guidance and interactivity that keeps you motivated in using it, first of all, and continuing with your dietary habits. And it takes a while, and once you've gotten used to a certain style of eating, then you likely stick to it, because eating low carb and high fat is, you don't have to restrict your calories, you don't have to eat stuff that doesn't taste good. Fat tastes good. And so together with Lumen and the motivational factors that I have mentioned, I think there's a very high chance of success that you'll reach your goals, be it weight loss, be it reduction of risk to develop a metabolic disease, maybe reducing the symptoms or eliminating them altogether if you already have diabetes or some of those other diseases I've mentioned before. So I think overall, despite the relatively high price tag, Lumen is worth it because it makes you stick to a low carb, high fat diet. And if you want, you can use discount code Michael Kummer to get 25 bucks off. That reduces the price a little bit and makes it more palatable. Now let's talk about a few of the things that I've learned. Now, I've been on a ketogenic Paleolithic diet for over a year. Paleo for 4 or 5 years, and then keto mixed in for over a year. And that paired with intermittent fasting that I've been practicing for over 1.5 years. So I want to argue that my lifestyle is already relatively healthy, in particular my dietary lifestyle. I do CrossFit 6 times a week, I sleep well, so I do a lot of things right. So I was kind of unsure whether or not there would be any value for me of using Lumen. So one of the things that Lumen confirmed to me is that I am indeed metabolically flexible. That wasn't really a big surprise because, I've been on keto for a while, fasting, etc. So I knew that I was metabolically flexible. But one of the things that I learned was that my blood ketone levels are not always directly correlated with my current state of metabolism. What that means is that, for example, if I go work out and do a high intensity workout like CrossFit and I empty my glycogen stores, at that point there is a lot of blood sugar in my bloodstream, obviously. And so my blood sugar levels would spike, and I could see that with my continuous blood glucose monitor. And whenever blood sugar is high and insulin levels are high, ketone levels are low. That's just, there is always that counterbalance, which is why you cannot be in ketosis if you have a lot of blood sugar or high blood sugar. And so what I found out was that even and especially after workouts where my blood sugar was high and my ketone levels were low, my body was very much burning fat for energy at that point. So that was not something I necessarily expected. The other thing that I found out was that if I had moderate amount of carbohydrates, that my body would be burning both fat and carbohydrates at the same time. And last but not least, during some of especially during calibration day and during some of the tests that I performed in between where I intentionally had a high carb day, my body would bounce back to burning predominantly fat very quickly. And that's that metabolic flexibility that I've mentioned before. If I eat 2 pizzas at night, the next morning I'm back in ketosis and I'm back at burning fat. And that's really incredibly powerful because that allows you then to have those cheat days if you want to and be right back at burning fat, be it your own body fat or being the fat that you consume with your diet. So the last thing that I'd like to mention is a couple of tips that I've learned by using Lumen now for approximately a month. And one is to take calibration day seriously. When I first got Lumen, it suggested on calibration day not to work out and to eat approximately, I think it was 278 grams of carbohydrates. That's more than what I eat in 2 weeks normally. So I'm like, I'm not gonna eat that many carbs. You know, I can't, I don't want to. And I don't wanna not work out. You know, today is workout day, so I'm gonna go work out. Well, guess what? Lumen couldn't establish a good baseline, so all my readings that followed were off. It constantly reported that I was burning mostly carbs. And I got frustrated and I talked to Lumen and said, how is that possible? I'm on keto, I intermittently fast, I work out a lot. And they're like, how did your calibration day go? And I explained to them like, well, you know, maybe you should redo calibration day and really follow the protocol. So I redid all of that. I prepared a little bit better. I bought somewhat healthy carbs like rice, like sweet potatoes and sweet plantains. And I had that high carb day on calibration day. It felt awful to me, to be quite honest, but I pushed through it anyway. I did it on a rest day where I didn't work out. And so after the proper calibration was done, my readings were in line with what I knew my body was doing and also with all my blood tests that I was performing. So that's tip number 1, take your calibration day seriously. Tip number 2 is when you do your breathing, make sure you sit down and you wait for a couple of minutes and you make sure your heart rate is low and ideally close to your resting heart rate. And that's because if your heart rate is high, then the CO2 in your breath might be different and it could make your results inaccurate. So don't do it right after running up a couple of stairs or whatever. And the app typically, if you allow the app access to your pedometer from your phone or from your Apple Watch or whatever, it can tell if you recently took a lot of steps and it tells you to sit and wait for 2 minutes. But make sure you sit down, you relax and you do your breathing while your heart rate is low. Otherwise the results are not gonna be super accurate. And the other thing that I want to bring up is a couple of things that I didn't like with Lumen. I want to be as fair as possible with all of the stuff that I review and want to give it the pros as well as the cons. And while there are a lot of good things about Lumen and while I truly believe it's a valuable tool that can help you to get on a better path to health, there are a couple of things that I didn't like a lot. And one is the breathing. Each breathing session takes approximately 2 minutes. Now, that's not a lot of time, of course, but if you're in a rush and you're in a hurry and you just want to do a quick breathing to see how your metabolism is doing, it's not going to work. So you have to sit down, you have to take your breath. Typically it takes between 2 and 3 breaths to get an accurate result. And there is a 15-second pause in between those breaths. And you need to turn on the device, bring up the app, wait until it's connected, takes a second or 2, and then do your breathing. So all in all, it takes about 2 minutes. And I wish, I don't know if that's technically even feasible, to have it like done with 1 breath and regardless of if you're sitting, walking or whatever. Maybe in the future we'll get that, but for now, It's, you know, it takes about 2 minutes, and just set yourself up for that. And I tend to be a person who is not very patient, and so when I first started using Lumen, I'm like, okay, you know, come on, I want to get on with it. But in reality, breathing is actually very healthy, and especially deep breathing. So take that opportunity to relax, wind down, don't think about anything, just do your breathing, look at the results, and move on with your day. And that was really the only thing that I would want to change, if that's technically even possible. Everything else really fulfilled my expectations. It's a solid device, it feels heavy, it doesn't feel cheap. You can tell that this is good hardware that was manufactured using quality components. It looks slick, the app works really well, it's interactive, it's motivational. So overall, I want to say that if your goal is to maybe lose weight, to increase your energy, to get healthier overall, and you want to go down that path of reducing your carb intake, it doesn't have to be ketogenic, but just lowering your carb intake, because according to the USDA dietary guideline for Americans, the daily amount of carbs that you should be eating is like 200 and something to 300 and something. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's what I eat in 2 weeks or less. So I encourage you to give Lumen a try, use my discount code if you want to do so, so you save 25 bucks, and let me know in the comments if you got Lumen, how it worked out for you, if you have any questions or concerns that I can answer before you pull the trigger. And as always, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.